Welcome to our fourth webinar this week, talking about the Baltimore Community Change Project. This is in a meeting session, so you might want to not turn on your camera if you don't want to be on the recording. And then after we have our little half-hour conversation, we will open it up for questions and stop the recording at that point so we can have a conversation. But the recording will go up on YouTube for other people to see. So today we're talking about the fifth issue brief in the Baltimore Community Change Project. There are 6 altogether. So the 6th one is actually at 4 o'clock this afternoon in case you want to keep joining us. My name is Seema Iyer. I oversee the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance at the University of Baltimore. A little bit about ourselves. We issue the annual Vital Signs Compendium of Data, which is a comprehensive set of information for communities to better understand quality of life in their communities. We've been around for 20 years, and we are the Baltimore partner of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is a learning network of over 30 cities around the country, trying to push out democratized data for all communities in our respective cities. We've been doing this for 20 years, and we know when any census comes out, that's like Christmas in August, I guess, when it came out. But when the 2020 census came out, we unfortunately saw a couple of things that were distressing for us as a city. The city lost 5.7% of its population overall, and Baltimore is the only East Coast city to lose any population. Cities up and down the East Coast between Richmond and Boston gained population, and which is really a reversal of a trend from the prior decades and the prior century, right? This was the decade for metropolitan winners, and in fact, the 2020 census had the worst population loss for rural areas around the country recorded in the census history for our country. So this is what we're up against. Baltimore used to be in the same company as all these cities, Philadelphia, New York, Washington. We all used to be losing population, and now all of them have turned themselves around, and we're the only ones sitting, in the population loss category. So what can we learn from these cities? How can we believe that we no longer have to be losing population, and how can we use data to really try and turn some of this around? So even though we lost population, it wasn't even across the city. For those of us that are from Baltimore, this is an unfortunate pattern of the areas in blue that were the ones that are growing, kind of up and down the spine of the city, around the water, out to the east. This is what Dr. Lawrence Brown from Morgan State University calls the white L of the city. And unfortunately, the areas that continue to lose population are the areas in red, which Dr. Brown has coined the term the black butterfly. These are predominantly African-American neighborhoods out here on the west and the east side that saw not only population loss, but significant population loss, and significant population loss for a second decade in a row. So this pattern is unfortunately very robust, and we have to really think about how can we use data to try and understand why this might be happening. And so in the Baltimore Community Change Project, we found a couple of different ideas competing against each other, or actually contributing to each other, I should say, that we actually seem to be having enduring divergence going on right in our own city, where some neighborhoods are growing and some neighborhoods are declining again and again and again. And so endurance comes from this idea of Robert Sampson, an urban sociologist, about the places themselves having enduring properties, and that's why we collect the data that we do. And divergence is coming from an economic idea by Enrico Morietti about how places themselves are kind of diverging in fortunes, economic, social, and cultural fortunes. And so the reason for this is because having that kind of a robust pattern actually is the result of network effects that are happening within our neighborhoods. And some neighborhoods have really positive reinforcement of their networks. They're getting everything once they get something. And for some of our neighborhoods, they're completely isolated. And in fact, this particular issue brief number 5, is all about connectedness and maybe, in fact, disconnectedness. And until we reconnect some of our neighborhoods to physical, digital, social, financial networks, we're going to keep seeing this pattern again. And that's what we're hoping to prevent in 2030. So, and obviously the lack of access and lack of connectedness seems to disproportionately be impacting existing neighborhoods of color, not historic neighborhoods of color. We're talking about today, things that are happening right now in our city. So that is the purpose of this entire project. We want the data to be a way to empower us all to not see the same pattern by 2030, and that the act of monitoring continuously, which is what BINIA will be doing for the next decade, is meant to be about empowerment and learning. These are the outline for all 6 of our reports. Today, we're going to just be talking about issue brief number 5. We've had webinars, and so you're happy to, please do take a look at some of our prior recordings on some of the other issue briefs. And then later on today, we're going to be talking about issue brief number 6, which is about quality of life. But the key takeaways, there's 3 main takeaways from this particular issue brief: that no digital access at home is highly correlated with neighborhoods that are predominantly African-American. So positive, if you have more people with no access at home, the neighborhoods were predominantly African-American. And conversely, when you did have access to the internet at home, you had more places of color. Neighborhoods that were predominantly white, which is why the negative here. So no access, less white; no access, more white, more African-American. Median income was going down as you increase the no access, which makes sense. And then conversely, higher unemployment in areas with no digital access. And then, finally, we have where we have no digital access is completely correlated to population decline, which makes sense because the digital infrastructure is how, the 21st century currency towards information and knowledge. What's also interesting is when we look at where we had people increase the rate of library uptake, it's really fascinating that it really is on this west side of town and coming up and down kind of that spine. This is where more people across the decade in these neighborhoods picked up a library card. And these happen to be the same places where we have low access to the internet at home. And so the library really seems to be serving as that place where people can access the internet. And when the libraries, unfortunately, potentially had to close, and Heidi Daniel is here to talk more about that during the pandemic, this is a double whammy, right? The library was that place to get that access, and that is exactly what shut down. So happy to talk about that. And then finally, the voter participation across the decade increased significantly. 2020 was our best year for voter participation. We had 58.8% of voters in the city of Baltimore vote in the 2020 election. But we can see that there's difference there too. We had very high voter participation in predominantly white neighborhoods and not in African-American neighborhoods. We had voter participation in areas with high median income, but not so much in areas with with high unemployment rates. And then also really interestingly, voter participation seems to be directly correlated with digital access, which not probably a shock for everybody that's on this room, but the data is very clear. So if you want to talk about digital equity, we're actually talking about all other kinds of equity too. We're talking about voter equity. We're talking about workforce equity. And so digital equity is just a means to all kinds of other equity that we might care about. Oops, that's a finding from a different one. So here are our respondents for today. Really appreciate you all being here and joining us today. We have Samantha Musgrove from Project Waves, Heidi Daniel from the Enoch Pratt Free Library, and Jason Jurjevich from Arizona State University. And we are going to put their full bios in the chat as they speak. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to each one of them to give like a 5-minute overview of what they saw when they read their reports. And I'm going to start off with Samantha. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Seema, and thank you to the entire BNIA for all of the work that you're doing to aggregate information about what our communities in Baltimore City, which are so diverse and facing so many different experiences, are experiencing right now. My name is Sam Musgrave. I'm the director at Project Waves. Project Waves provides free internet service to residents in Baltimore City, focused on serving the most historically underserved parts of Baltimore City. So We have 55 community statistical areas here in Baltimore, and Project Waves exists in the least connected of 13 of those community statistical areas. Our focus really remains on ensuring that everyone in Baltimore has ubiquitous access to internet service, which they need and deserve to remain and to become and remain stable. As I look at the issue brief, connectivity in Baltimore City, one of the things that stands out to me the most is that our service demographic, where we provide free internet service in partnership with organizations like the Enoch Pratt Free Library system and Baltimore City Public Schools, and with grassroots organizations across the city, is that it's truly that the digital divide impacts folks disproportionately in ways that mirrors race and socioeconomic lines. Disconnectivity is truly a mirror image of the black butterfly and that white L. 77% of our first 200 connections are identifying as Spanish speakers only at home or members of the immigrant community. And so as I read about the ways in which digital disconnectivity are impacting specific community members and neighborhoods, neighborhoods like Lakeland and Southeast Baltimore, where we partnered with Enoch Pratt to provide free internet service to households, really stand out to me, namely because signing up for a resource like internet access often requires provision of personally identifying information. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Comcast was requiring that Baltimore residents signing up for the Internet Essentials program, which was their first iteration of low-cost internet service, provide an EIN or social security number. And we stepped in when school shutdowns occurred and Internet Essentials was kind of being lauded as the first program to serve low-income households, to say that we're not going to require provision of social security numbers or EINs. And that really opened the floodgates to understand the disproportionate ways in which internet service and the digital divide is frankly being perpetuated on the Spanish-speaking community. As I look at the brief and we kind of applaud, frankly, and we should be applauding the ways that we've made progress here with federal funding from ARPA to close the digital divide here in Maryland and specifically in Baltimore, where $400 million is coming to the state of Maryland or has come to the state to specifically focus on internet access. We have to keep in mind that that is the first step. Right, we are moving out of the crisis phase of this moment in history that I think all of us are dealing with right now. But with a 40% disconnectivity rate in Baltimore City, where 40% of residents do not have home internet service, we have to focus on the transition from crisis response directly into service delivery, as we have access to the funds needed to ensure that resources are available for people to connect. We also need to marry that with community resources that provide intermediaries between these programs and the people they need to reach. I would like to speak just briefly about the American or the ACP, the American Connectivity Program, which provides a $30 per month subsidy to any qualified household. There are many ways to qualify, but most Baltimore City residents are qualified through either the school system, which is the free lunch program or free meal program, or through just basic income requirements. If you live at less than 200% of the federal poverty line, you are qualified to receive a $30 per month federal subsidy, which is matched at 50% by the state of Maryland. So you end up with $45 per month to pay for your internet service bill. And you may not know about that because you might not be connected to the internet. And so my big push right now is to ensure that everyone on this call, partners and community members alike, are really talking about the ways in which we can become the intermediaries of access to these resources and receipt of these resources. I work every day with customers who are totally unaware of their eligibility to receive free internet service subsidized by both the feds and the state, because they're not online and they're not seeing the advertisements on the internet. And the barriers for onboarding into those plans are relatively high. So there are, there's specific documentation requirements to prove eligibility and all of that. There are ways in which community organizations and community organizers like us can truly respond to people who are eligible and who may not be knowledgeable about eligibility for these programs. We can absolutely assist customers with signing up for the ACP, the American Connectivity Program, but we can also work together as a community of organizers and service providers to ensure that we are providing resources like digital navigators to people in the community who may be interested in receiving free internet service or subsidized internet service through any number of providers, to ensure that they have the assistance they need to prove eligibility and to sign up for that, and to ensure that we aren't creating unnecessary barriers to the recipient of those resources that exist within our community. Yeah, that's what we're doing.
Thanks so much, Sam. And so important to think about that last inch or that last mile, what we call that, even though something might be over here and something might be over here, it's all about making that connection. So thanks for that. We are very happy to have Heidi Daniel here, who's the president and CEO of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, and happy to take your thoughts on the issue brief.
Well, thanks, Seema, for inviting me today to reflect on this leadership brief. I think the one thing that stood out to me right away, obviously you call out library cards in the report right away, and it was nothing that obviously is surprising to us, right? Because the library has known for years that we were the main place for people who weren't connected to get connected. So when COVID hit, everyone started talking about the digital divide and digital equity. And public libraries, obviously I'm representing the Pratt, but I can tell you it's public libraries across the country. We knew for 20 some years that there was a big digital divide and digital gap, because we see it every single day. And obviously that was one of our biggest concerns when COVID hit, was how do we make those connections? And it was amazing to have partners like Project Waves and PNC and some others who came on board and helped think through, how do we get internet to people's homes, and or how do we get them internet when they're not here? Device deployment, hotspots, trying models of extensions of our Wi-Fi, the receivers, trying various ways to do in-home internet access. We did it for a long time, actually, under one thing that people don't always know about the Enoch Pratt Free Library is we're also the State Library Resource Center. So we have actually broadband throughout the state of Maryland that we maintain to provide broadband access for all public libraries, as well as some other key academic institutions throughout the state. So for years, we provided dial-up to people's homes. And when we started following up with people who were no longer providing dial-up for, what we found was that they just didn't have anything now. They were going to their public library instead of having at-home internet, because they just didn't replace it, whether that be because they didn't see the value of the internet, because they didn't have anyone guiding them through the correct digital literacy and skill set trainings, or they weren't aware of it, or they just didn't have the funds and ability to provide in-home internet. So one of the things that sticks out is the fact that the libraries that had the highest increase in cardholders, and we know this because we look at our data on a regular basis, but also, Seema, you put it in the report, were libraries that aren't connected in connected communities, right? The more disconnected a community was, the more we saw library card increases. So Park Heights, for example, is one of the neighborhoods that has the highest number of library card holders, despite the fact that we're working and advocating for a library to be built in that neighborhood. But those are individuals who we presume are traveling on buses to get to Penn North or Forest Park. So we know that those are communities where our services are most needed. And one of the things that you said, that Seema, that really sticks out to me was digital equity means all kinds of equity, right? It's not just digital equity. And I think from the library's perspective, that's one of the lessons that we would share out, is we know from everyday experience. Individuals come into our spaces and they come in and perhaps they want to see, they want to use the computer, and it never stops there. So they are looking for jobs, they need employment access, and we find out as they're trying to fill out the application and they come to our staff for help, that we have a little bit of work to do, because maybe it's employment application, but it's also they don't have computer literacy skill sets and they need a little bit more help. And then you also find out they have some housing issues, maybe they're about to be evicted, or maybe they are going to have a challenge passing a drug screening, or maybe they need an expungement in order to go to that next step in their job. So for us, we have focused for quite a number of years. In the 4 years that I've been here, or 4.5 years, we've expanded services like social worker in the library, lawyer in the library. We've introduced recently peer navigators to help with recovery coaching and connecting people to additional resources, because what we know is that it never stops with just one kind of equity, right? It embraces a lot of needs. And so one of the things that the library can do through partnering with agencies and community-based organizations is provide a lot of these wraparound services in a space that is viewed as non-judgmental and safe, and where people in the community are already used to going. So one of the things that stood out for me from that report is that's the kind of work that we really need to double down on. Internally, one of the things that we have been talking about is the fact that, yes, computer usage obviously declined while we were closed because no one had access to our computers. So there's lots of things that we need to think about, which is continually being thoughtful about how we make sure people are connected to some of the services that Sam mentioned, the emergency broadband and the ACF, right, it's ACF, yes. The connectivity, the $30 a month credit, because, and our staff are aware of those and they're trained in those and they're trained to help people sign up for those, but also exploring what other models are available for individuals if those don't work for them. When the pandemic first hit, we had a lot of people that came in and did not want to sign up for the emergency broadband program because they had already been turned down for various reasons for that program, right? Or they had an outstanding bill, and so we had to walk them through, how things have changed with COVID and how they might now be qualified. But there is still that distrust of large internet providers that I think needs to be called out from traditionally underserved communities, right? So Black and Brown communities in particular, who haven't been well served by large internet providers, may still have a lot of distrust issues around there. And so that's where our staff at the library and community-based organizations can really work to make sure people are informed and aware of changes, of their rights, of how the programs work, and really guide them through that process. We really have, Sam mentioned digital navigators, and that is, I think something that we're all working on connecting together is all of our digital navigation models. And for us, our staff does a lot of this, and we're enhancing that through making sure we have trained and adequate people in those positions, so that when people come in, if it's at the Southeast Anchor Library, they speak Spanish, they can, help with those assistants. And, again, our staff has been doing this for a number of years. You'll hear librarians say, I didn't know when I was going to get my master's degree that I was going to spend so much time helping people fill out forms on the internet, but it's just something that we've been doing for a number of years because so many things have transitioned to all online with no thought, right, to how that impacts the people who need to access those services in terms of skill sets and access. So even as we start to address access in our communities, one of the things that for the library that we're going to continue to focus on strongly are those wraparound whole person services, because connectedness goes beyond the internet. We all know that. And it means connectedness to voting resources, to all of those education, to civic engagement resources. And those are the things that we've been doing well for a number of years, and we just need to ramp them up and enhance them. And we're going to use this data and look at this data to make sure that we're being wise in our investment in our communities and in our branch neighborhoods. We're fortunate as an institution to have 22 locations throughout the city, right? So throughout the Black Butterfly and the White Owl. But I think as the population shifts, it's easy to disinvest in neighborhoods where we're seeing less usage. So one of the things that I would also really call out for data is our need to define what we all consider to be meaningful data. And this is something from a library's perspective, and I don't think we're alone, we've been talking about for a number of years, because a traditional data point for us would be, for example, circulation. So that's great. But if I went to, let's say, you know, I'm gonna pick on some branches here. If we go to Roland Park and I pick out 50 books because I'm gonna sit at home for the weekend and have a like nice, cozy binge reading weekend, that's fantastic and such a great use of the library, right? And it counts as 50 on my numbers. But then if someone goes to, you know, Southeast Anchor Library and they get help filling out an application and they meet with a social worker and they talk to a lawyer and our staff guides them through some additional resources they need, and maybe, you know, they attend a bilingual story time, that might not actually even appear in some of our statistics. Maybe it appears in our programming statistic, but that's it. But it has a huge impact, right? Probably way more impact than that 50, even though I love people who come in and check out 50 books and read all weekend. That's, you know, the impact is going to be at the Southeast Anchor Library, where maybe we didn't even get more than one count for our stats. So it's really thinking through, what does data mean and how do we collect it and what does it look like, and making sure that we're all in agreement about what is impactful data for us to report and collect. And I think that that's a little tricky because the soft stuff can be harder to collect, but we've got to do it. We've got to get better at it so that reports like this present a full picture of Baltimore, of the city, of the residents it's serving, and of the adequate needs of those individuals, and how we make sure that communities are connected to the resources as well as to the access, because it's a dual coin and they need both sides, right? So that the whole neighborhood can rise and the whole community can rise. And so that as institutions, we are ensuring that we're putting our investments in the places that can grow and need the investment and aren't just where the population is or where that spine or that white L is, right? So those are my initial requests.
Heidi, if we were all in the room together, you'd be getting a standing ovation right now. So this is the virtual standing ovation. Thank you so much for those comments. They're so spot on and everything you just said. But I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and then we'll have a quick panel conversation afterwards to talk to each of you. Jason is our good friend in the NNIP world for many years, but now he is at the Arizona State University. And Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you for your impressions.
Thanks, Seema. Appreciate you inviting me here today. And I want to thank you and the team at BNIA. This is really a comprehensive set of reports, really impressive work, and especially having led efforts in Portland, Oregon, with respect to using data for more equitable policy. I know that these reports are going to be used you know, in Baltimore to affect some real positive change. So kudos to you and your entire team. I'm a human geographer with interest in demographics and voting at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And I've done a little bit of work in the past involving voting patterns for mayor across the 30 largest cities in a project that was called Who Votes for Mayor. You can find that analysis at whovotesformayor.org. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the takeaways that I saw in the report regarding voting participation in Baltimore, and then also connecting it to the analysis that we did, albeit a number of years outdated. It was based on the mayoral election of Stephanie Rawlings Blake in 2011, but I do think there are some important connections between the on-the-ground voting participation that we saw in our research versus what you have in terms of the report, which is more updated data for gubernatorial and presidential elections. The first thing I think that's really important to think about with respect to voting in Baltimore, especially for mayor, is there's good news in that Baltimore City holds its mayoral elections the same year as presidential elections. And that is not to be, that's a takeaway that I think is really not to be overlooked, because most American cities do not do that. They hold mayoral elections on off-cycle elections, which is really problematic for a number of reasons with respect to overall voter participation. And those voters that do participate in those elections tend to be older. They tend to not reflect the racial and ethnic diversity of the full community. They tend to be wealthier, and a host of other characteristics that's not representative of the city at large. So I think that's really important for Baltimore City. When we looked at the 2011 Baltimore mayoral election, in Baltimore, we actually got the data at a granular level from Baltimore City elections, and we took those individual level data and we actually geocoded them for the entire city and merged them with census data to be able to provide a more detailed portrait of what was happening with respect to mayoral voting in Baltimore City. So when I looked at the report, overall, the voter participation, as the report notes, was quite high for Baltimore City in 2020 in the presidential. It was 58.8%, which is one of the highest voter participation rates over the past decade. Although I should point out that that's roughly 10% below the national average in terms of voter participation in the presidential. So although Baltimore City had a higher turnout in 2020, it was below the national average. This gets a little bit technical, admittedly, but I do think it's important for you all in Baltimore City to talk about as you move forward, which is the denominator. So the denominator for that statistic is the percentage of registered voters as the denominator. And in the work that we had done in the Who Votes for Mayor project, we actually used a denominator called CVAP, which stands for Citizen Voting Age Participation. And what that is it's the denominator of eligible voters of voting age 18 and above. And so that when you take the total number of voters and you divide by that more exhaustive denominator, you get a better sense of the number of people that voted out of the eligible population versus the number of people who were registered. We know that voter registration is already a selective process unto itself. And so I think moving forward, if there's a way that that BNIA and other community organizations can look towards including CVAP as a denominator, I think that could be really important for improving voter participation in Baltimore City. When we did that in 2011, with the voter participation in Baltimore as a percentage of the of CVAP, we found that we looked at the primary election that was held in the beginning of 2011, and then we looked at the general election that was held at the end. In 2011, 14.8% of Baltimore eligible voters voted in the primary election, 14.8%, which means, right, 85% of eligible voters did not vote. What we then did was looked at the turnout in the general. Now, in this case, the primary, because of Baltimore's politics being largely Democratic, the primary is actually more competitive than the general. And in the general election, it actually fell from 14% to 9%. So fewer than 1 in 10 voters in 2011 voted in the mayoral race, which I just, unfortunately is not that uncommon compared to most American cities. The other recommendation I would have is for you to really look at age moving forward, because the intersection between voter participation and age is exceptionally important, not only in Baltimore City, but across the country. And there's a couple of different data points that we reported in the 2011 race that I think would probably hold in 2016 and in 2020. 18 to 34-year-olds in Baltimore City in 2011 represented 37% of the population. More than 1 in 3 residents in Baltimore in 2011 was between 18 and 34, but they cast just 12% of all ballots. And so that really speaks to them really punching below their weight with respect to their potential for influencing the election. Conversely, voters over age 65 voted at much higher percentage rates. And this is a consistent trend across the country. In Baltimore City, in 2011, voters age 65 and over were just 15% of the population, but accounted for almost 30% of all ballots cast, more than double their percentage. So I think connecting age and turnout is really going to be important moving forward. And then the other takeaway that I've got that I think is really interesting, and I didn't get a chance to fully get my arms around this, but if you go back to the voter participation statistics that you had, between 2010 and 2020, the voter participation rate based on registered voters went from 44 to 58%, which is really great. It went up 14% over the decade. But there were certain neighborhoods, predominantly in the Black Butterfly, as previously mentioned, where voter participation just didn't go up. It went down by 10 to 15%. Edmondson Village, the biggest decline, which is shocking to me, especially having personal connections with family in Edmondson Village. Cherry Hill, many other neighborhoods in West Baltimore. Not only is that sort of really disconcerting, but then I also looked at the relationship to voting deserts, which is what we did in our Who Votes for Mayor project. And there was a little bit of incongruence between what we found in 2011 and what we found in 2020. Now, that may be a result of just different elections, but the sort of curiosity, sort of academic side of me really wants to explore that in more detail to really sort of tease out what's happening with respect to what we saw earlier and versus what was happening in 2020. I think in the entirety, for all the data that are presented in this report regarding voting, these data are absolutely foundational to ensuring that we think more carefully about ballot delivery, access, and barriers to voting in Baltimore City. And this is an incredible start to having that conversation. But I think, like many good projects, it raises a lot more questions than it does in terms of providing answers. So I really look forward to seeing where you all go in terms of moving the needle on this. So thank you.
Oh, wow. You would be getting a standing ovation too. So, but you're absolutely right. The whole project is meant to be the basis for all of us to then work together to change these numbers. We don't want these numbers to be back here in 2030, and to be very interactive so that people can make those kinds of very specific things like what happened in Edmondson Village and what can we do now, and for all of the other work that you did. So I just want to kind of point out that there's, to me, what was so fascinating was the interrelationship between where we had drops in voting and where we had increases in library and where we had no access to the internet. I don't know if this is something, and obviously Heidi, you spoke a lot about why this might be true, but how do we kind of think about that interrelationship in thinking about how people actually do their work? Like, how do people actually vote and how do actually people get to the internet? I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on kind of that relationship between all three of them or anything that you heard.
Can we speak and respond, or is that?
Yes, please.
Okay. I was like, I wasn't sure if that's what was. So one thing I just wanted to say is, like, definitely with the voting piece. So normally at the library, we would be doing a lot of in-person voting activities, right? With League of Women Voters or Black Girl Votes, or like different organizations who would be helping people through that process. And even with the census, you know, pre-COVID, we had planned like Census Sundays. We were going to open on Sundays and have people like register to vote and take the census and do all those things. And so with COVID, the closure of those physical spaces really did impact people's ability to, and not just the library, but other spaces to get access. I mean, we put in some locations, we were able to put like computer kiosks in the lobbies to help people register to vote. But if they didn't have a place to go and they didn't have computer access, and someone a lot of times to guide them through the registration, or you know, obviously we can't help, there's limitations to what we can do to help people register to vote legally, but even to just alert people like, hey, are you registered to vote? Also, people could drop off, you know, mail, like their voter registration that they mail in. People can drop those off the library and we mail them in for them. It's been historically forever. I think every library in the country does that. And, you know, that was gone this year too. So, I mean, just from our perspective, there were a lot of services around voting that we would provide that we weren't able to provide in a way that was as comprehensive as normal. This year, we did do some outdoor registrations and other events, but there was also just a caution and a hesitation from communities to come out to events. I don't know what other community-based organizations who work even deeper in this area might have seen, but my guess is that that lack of connectivity overlaps with that. I mean, just an educated guess would be that that overlaps, right? And that lack of in-person conversation that happens as well to help assist people around questions around registering to vote and all of that.
Well, that's a perfect segue into, for all of us, if you guys want to maybe close us out with some words of advice as we head into next week, because next week I think is the very first time that many of us are actually getting together post-pandemic. These are small group conversations, no more than 30 or 40 people in a room. So what advice might you have for us as we kind of foray back together and learn from each other and use these data around the specific topics that we talked about today? I don't know, Sam, you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. So for anyone on the call who's involved in direct service delivery, ensuring that you're aware of what's out there and what's available to folks when it comes to digital access and connectivity, and that you're aware of the programs that Enoch Pratt is offering in person. So for example, the lawyer in the library, social worker in the library. These are incredibly important resources that are available to everyone. And unfortunately, they are not directly included in the way that we're receiving funding right now for COVID relief or for things like the digital divide. We don't have access to the navigators that are being provisioned by folks like the Enoch Pratt. We need to ensure that we are communicating openly, widely with our neighbors, that these resources are available and that there's resources to help connect folks to them. I know that from Project Wave's perspective, if there is anyone struggling to connect to internet service in Baltimore City, even if we can't connect them directly as a service provider, we can connect them to the ACP. We can connect them to folks like the Enoch Pratt. We can connect them to folks like PCs for People, who will help them to navigate the application process and the qualification process in those areas. And I would really encourage anyone who has a friend or a neighbor in need of resources, whether it's healthcare, whether it's internet service, whether it's anything, to really ensure that they're connected to the community organizations that are serving them and that are focused on ensuring that those resources get used. Because the reality is funding is allocated to programming like this, and it's only going to be as good as the people it's reaching. And so from my perspective, it's truly important for us to ensure that we're connecting with those who are least connected, first and foremost, and making sure that we have the people on the other end of that call or that outreach effort to ensure that people have what they need and deserve.
Yeah, this idea of each one of us is a navigator. And really taking that on as part of our roles to make like different neighborhoods cross over. What can we do together to do that? Heidi, any suggestions for next week?
Yeah, I mean, I love what Sam said, and just piggybacking off of that, I think one thing that I would love for conversations to be had around is just how we strengthen that whole ecosystem of organizations and people, and get everyone connected into sort of the web, right? I think one thing is we're in Baltimore, we can be very hyper local, which is both a strength and can also be a little bit of a challenge. And bringing in those diversity of services and creating like a strong ecosystem and sort of thinking through, all of the things, right? All of the buzzy things, 20-minute neighborhoods, and all the things we're talking about in other places, and how do we use that to really strengthen the connectedness of our neighbors and make sure that we're sharing out that information. I think we have so many amazing organizations, even here on this call, like that work together in so many ways, and to just bring that forward. And to Sam's point, we have a once in a lifetime sort of opportunity around funding. So making sure that like it's reflective of what the community needs and heightens the connectivity.
Jason.
So I would just say, reiterate some of the things I had mentioned earlier. I think it's really going to be important next week to, one, celebrate these data with respect to the increased turnout for Baltimore City over the past decade. I think that's really important. But of course, then quickly moving to doing the work that's necessary to address the declines in turnout that are illustrated in the report, primarily in West Baltimore, and as well as areas in East Baltimore and the Black Butterfly. And really thinking about not only what future quantitative data might look like with respect to CVAP, or even more granular data by getting it from Baltimore City elections, but thinking about those obstacles that might have been implemented over the past decade to really get your arms around that as voting becomes more difficult in many states, taking stock of what might have happened in the state of Maryland or within Baltimore City, particularly within these certain neighborhoods that are experiencing declines. And I think really to get your arms around that, I would encourage maybe community groups, which probably have many answers to these questions, by thinking more like local on the ground, talking to precinct captains who often have a really good command of what's happening on the ground locally as to what might be the barriers in Edmondson Village, for example, as to why we saw a 12% decline over the past decade when the city's voting participation went up 12%. And so having those qualitative data in concert with the quantitative data that BNI has put together, I think will be a fundamental step to ensuring a more healthy, representative democratic participation in Baltimore City.
Awesome. If anybody is a precinct captain, please join us for sure. If you know any, we'd love to have you join us for the rest of next week. We're heading into our Community Change Summit. There are 6 different convenings going on next week. I hope all of you have chosen to be at least on one of them. You will have folks from your own neighborhood being paid facilitators as part of the process. And then tonight we actually have trivia nights, which are fun ways for neighborhoods to get to know each other. The questions may be hard, but when you're on a team, you'll be able to figure it out. So join us today. You can get a shirt from Fearless Sports if you win, and stay connected with us as we move through this process and beyond next week, coming up with solutions to help us eliminate neighborhood disparities in Baltimore. Thanks so much to all of our panelists, and we're going to stop the recording now. And if our panelists can stick around.